Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, life in the fast lane, searching for a solution on the question of net neutrality. Where does the internet go from here? Television news in Thailand fades to black as the military moves in. Plus, journalism without a safety net, the freelancers trying to cover Syria. And big changes at the New York Times and Le Monde as two of the most powerful women in print journalism take the fall. There's a battle underway in Washington over the way the World Wide Web should work. The stakes are high, and not just Americans stand to be affected. If the internet really is an information superhighway, should there be a fast lane for those who can afford to pay the price and a slow lane for those who can't? Or should everybody, all those websites and blogs, be treated equally, regardless of whether they have big corporate backing or are just small independent voices? The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, is trying to figure all that out as it proposes a new set of rules to govern the use of broadband in the United States to make it work in an orderly way without stifling freedom of expression. Critics of the FCC's plan argue that the changes will allow internet service providers, ISPs, to create a two-tiered internet and charge websites that can't afford it a premium for access to the fast lane, which could spell the end of what's known as net neutrality. The challenge is how to preserve net neutrality without regulating the life out of the internet and turning innovation into collateral damage of the regulatory process. Got all that? Our starting point this week is Washington, D.C.
What this is really about is it's a battle over who controls the future of communications. Will it be the people who use the internet, or it will be the powerful corporations that provide internet access to people? And this issue of our internet service providers, information services or telecommunication services, goes right to the core of that question.
To understand this debate, one has to rewind to 2002. Until that time, the Federal Communications Commission classified internet service providers in the U.S. as common carriers. Like airlines, railroads, and taxicab companies, they were licensed to transport goods, in this case communications, to provide services to the public without discrimination. But in 2002, the Bush administration, not wanting to limit the growth of the net, deregulated it in a way, temporarily waiving the common carrier status of ISPs. And ever since 2010, the FCC has been trying to figure out a new set of rules for how ISPs operate.
It's important to recognize that there are no protections for an open internet in place today.
And it's about to take some contentious recommendations to Congress.
There's always been the expectation that any website would download at the speed that a consumer buys from their internet service providers. So in other words, all content on the internet, be it a streaming video, be it a news website, or Facebook, will all be treated equally on the internet. And that's where the term net neutrality comes from. What the Federal Communications Commission is considering is the idea that there might be the ability of internet service providers to charge those websites for their content to travel a little bit faster than other sites based on how much they pay.
The argument of the net neutrality advocates is that if the internet providers are able to decide the winners and losers online in favor of certain companies, that the next Google or the next Facebook or whatever else is never going to get off the ground. The upstarts will never be able to afford that fast lane and will always be at a disadvantage.
The big ISPs are multi-billion-dollar concerns with legions of lobbyists at their disposal in D.C. What is working against them, however, is the consumer climate. The latest American Customer Satisfaction Index just happened to come out this past week. It concluded that of the 43 industries U.S. consumers were asked about, ISPs came in dead last in customer satisfaction, just below the cable television industry, and many of those ISP and cable companies are one and the same. And with two of those mega media conglomerates, Time Warner Cable and Comcast, now in merger talks.
While this transaction will make us bigger, that's a good thing, not a problem.
The prospect of even greater concentration in U.S. media means that groups like Tech Freedom, a D.C. think tank that says it's not lobbying for the ISPs, but which refuses to disclose its funding, has its work cut out when it echoes the big ISPs' talking points.
It's 28 leading companies that have poured money, $1.2 trillion since 1996, into broadband. And what they're really saying is that they've made huge capital investments. They continue to invest about $60 billion a year into broadband. And all of that is put in jeopardy by the FCC's attempt or even considering making broadband a public utility.
You'll certainly see internet service providers saying that if you strap too many rules on us, it's going to be really difficult to invest more in our networks. It just slows us down. And, you know, from a consumer's point of view, it's something that you need to wrestle with. You may like the idea of an internet service provider being considered more like a public utility. But also, when you're at home and trying to watch that Netflix video and you're seeing that pinwheel circle and circle around, you really want to make sure that your ISP offers you faster speeds than what they're offering today. So it's definitely a balance.
We've actually looked at the history of common carrier rules, and we found when the common carrier rules were in effect prior to 2002 that these companies actually did invest more money in building out networks. So there's nothing in the historical data that would suggest that creating a common carrier rule for information networks would impede their ability to continue to improve on these networks.
The net neutrality movement is leery of big corporate players, but in this debate, it's on the same side as some of them. The Googles and Facebooks of Silicon Valley are aligned with the net neutrality activists, and together they are out to thwart the distributors, ISPs like Comcast and Verizon.
Basically all of the biggest tech companies, is Google, Facebook, Netflix, Amazon, all signed on to this letter supporting net neutrality. And they don't want to have to pay. They're worried that they could end up being discriminated against. And they also argue that it's a free speech issue, that this is how the internet has succeeded, is as this level playing field. But the net neutrality advocates would say this is about more than just market power. This is about how we express ourselves politically, that you shouldn't have a handful of massive corporations that are able to favor certain companies over others.
The groups that have been pushing this are driven mostly by activists and not by lawyers, people who fundamentally reject a corporate involvement in the internet, who resent the idea that private capital and private companies have built the internet. They would frankly prefer a government-run, government-owned internet.
We have to be very clear here that this is not about a government takeover of the internet. This is simply about trying to make sure that users have control over their internet experience. So they are spending a lot of money. They are trying to distort the debate. They spend money on lobbyists, which is something they have to report in the public record in the United States so we can see what they're doing.
So at the end of the day, really, I can't emphasize this enough. The best course here would be for all of those parties to go to Congress and make their case, and for this matter to be sorted out the way that any hard question is sorted out in democracy, which is by our elected representatives, not by 3 bureaucrats at the FCC.
Which sounds fine in principle until you follow the money. In the past month, 28 members of Congress have signed letters to the FCC backing the ISPs in this fight. According to Maplight, a nonprofit that examines the effect of money on U.S. politics, the Republican letter writers received roughly 5 times as much in campaign contributions from the cable industry than the average member of Congress. And the Democratic leader of the House, Nancy Pelosi, owns more Comcast stock than any other congressperson. That's why the net neutrality movement is pushing the FCC so hard before it makes its final recommendations to a Congress that may be too well funded to be neutral in the debate over net neutrality in America. Our Global Village voices now on the fight over net neutrality.
When new innovative websites can't afford high fees for faster service, they'll be way less likely to reach users and less likely to succeed. The result? A less diverse internet. We don't want regulations that will turn internet providers into gatekeepers to their subscribers, channeling what sites we're most likely to visit by throttling connection speeds. This amounts to a form of effective censorship.
The whole point of the internet is that it's free and open with equal access for everybody, that if you have something to say, it doesn't matter who you are, that you're able to participate inside of that and compete with any of the biggest players. And the reason why this is important is because the US and the policies and regulation the US adapts have a tendency to become adopted worldwide and set a precedent for worldwide.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The coup d'etat in Thailand has had a sweeping impact on broadcasting there, with television and radio stations effectively silenced. National cable and satellite channels and some local outlets have been required to stop their regular programming on the Army's orders and broadcast military announcements only. International broadcasters, including CNN, Al Jazeera, and the BBC, have also been taken off the air. The deputy editor of the Thai Public Broadcasting Service was reportedly arrested when the network tried to broadcast news on YouTube. The military has said the broadcasters were shut down to prevent them spreading false information and to maintain law and order. Thais found themselves living under martial law following 6 months of unrest between pro and anti-government protesters. Dozens of troops took over the facilities of the country's only satellite operator to make sure, the military said, that all the information reaching the public is accurate. Print media have also been affected. The law now requires them to self-censor any news or quotes critical of the new authorities. Two of the world's most powerful newspaper editors, both of them women, have left their positions, and gender may have been a factor in one of their departures. Jill Abramson, the executive editor of the New York Times, and Nathalie Nouguet-Reid, editor-in-chief of the French Le Monde, were both the first women to take the top editorial posts at their respective publications. The Times' publisher, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., fired Abramson May 14th, less than 3 years after she was appointed. The New Yorker magazine reported that Abramson had confronted her bosses after discovering she was paid less than her male predecessor, although Sulzberger denies that. He issued a statement saying Abramson was in fact turfed over arbitrary decision-making, a failure to consult, and the public mistreatment of colleagues. Abramson has been replaced by her managing editor, Dean Baquet, the paper's first African-American editor. And in France, Nathalie Nouguet-Reid stepped down after a power struggle over Le Monde's digital strategy. 7 of her senior editors had already quit over Nouguet-Reid's plans to transfer print staff to the digital side, develop a new online approach, and launch a revamped print format. "I cannot accept being undermined as head of the paper," she wrote. Nouguet-Reid was elected to run Le Monde as per the tradition there, but she was subsequently accused of an authoritarian and Putin-like management style. Le Monde is France's most popular daily behind Le Figaro, but it has struggled with debt despite getting 16 million euros in government subsidies. They say justice delayed is justice denied. Still, 7.5 years after the murder of the prominent Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, a Moscow court has finally convicted 5 men for her killing. 3 of those convicted are brothers, Rustam Ibragim and Jabrail Makhmudov. The other 2 men are their uncle and a former police officer. In 2009, all 5 were tried and acquitted in a verdict that embarrassed Russian prosecutors and led to the Supreme Court ordering a new trial. Politkovskaya was shot dead in the lobby of her Moscow apartment in October of 2006. She worked for the Novaya Gazeta newspaper and investigated human rights abuses in Chechnya. Her murder underscored the challenges that independent and anti-Kremlin journalists can face in Russia. The convictions were welcomed by the Politkovskaya family, but they say they remain disappointed that while the triggermen have been identified, whoever ordered the killing is still free. Earlier this month, on World Press Freedom Day, the Paris-based organization Reporters Without Borders called Syria the most dangerous country in the world to be a journalist. More than 150 reporters have lost their lives there since 2011. The reluctance of news outlets to send their own people is understandable, and that's meant that a lot of the journalism has been done by freelancers. Freelancing is tough. The pay tends to be low. You don't get the backing of an employer. And if you're kidnapped or wounded, it can take a while before the news gets out. And in a conflict as dangerous as Syria, there's a lot that can go wrong. The Listening Post's Gauri Sharma now on the challenges that freelance journalists face to bring you the Syrian story.
In the 3 years of the Syrian conflict, more than 140,000 people have been killed. 9 million Syrian civilians have been displaced, and the country has become one of the most dangerous places to report from. Around 150 journalists have been killed since the fighting began. 9 foreign and around 20 domestic journalists are being held hostage by the opposition forces or are missing. A further 40 Syrian media workers are in government prisons. What these figures don't tell us is how many of them went to Syria as freelancers.
It is the nature of the modern news industry today that more and more of the really dangerous stuff gets done by freelance, independent individuals, unsupported by news organizations.
We've seen so many freelancers married to the story. They really follow their subjects in an exceptional way, and we see it in the amazing material that has come through.
Syria's turned out to be arguably the most dangerous story that journalists have covered, physically dangerous. Certainly in my career, which is what, 25, 30 years.
You may have seen these images in the mainstream media, but none of the photographers who took them work exclusively for the outlets they featured in. This shot of the rebel siege of Aleppo in 2012 was taken by Mexican Javier Manzano for the Agence France-Presse. It earned him a Pulitzer Prize. These images, capturing the human cost of the conflict, were taken for the Associated Press by Spanish freelancer Manu Bravo. And The Guardian ran these photos by Spanish journalist Maisun last year. But stories like this come at a price.
Oh, Jesus.
One example is that of American journalist Austin Tice, who went missing while on assignment in Syria in August 2012. Heard from only once, reportedly, in this video that was posted on YouTube 2 months after his abduction. There has been some respite. In April, 4 French journalists were released after spending 10 months in captivity in northern Syria. But their case is the exception in the country, and it's become a story that more and more staff journalists are turning down, and those on a freelance arrangement are relied on to tell.
I've compared freelancers in war zones to garment workers in Bangladesh. There's a demand for sneakers, and there are garment workers who are willing to be paid very little money to produce shoes in unsafe conditions. I mean, it's supply meets demand. The freelancer is getting paid, the editor's getting their story, and the public's getting their news. It's just not happening in a safe way.
In Syria, I mean, if you cover the regime side or if you cover the rebel side, in the end it's the same. You're simply a foreigner. You have nobody to rely upon if something happens.
Italian-born journalist Francesca Borri should know. Borri has spent the last 3 years covering Syria for Italian outlets. Last July, she wrote a scathing critique on how the mainstream media treats those working on a freelance basis. She described freelancers as second-class journalists who get paid meagre wages. She wrote, "Not only can you not afford insurance, but you cannot afford a fixer or a translator. You find yourself alone in the unknown."
In an ideal world, all these things would be catered for. The freelancers would be paid a lot more money. I think there are examples of freelancers being sent into situations, into conflicts, where either they're not adequately trained, protected, or necessarily particularly well insured. It's not an ideal world because finances are so stretched, which people going to conflict zones, in Syria in particular, should be fully aware of.
It's complicated because if a freelance isn't being controlled or employed or engaged on commission, surely the industry shouldn't have a responsibility if they don't have the control. However, you then get the other side of that coin, whereby some in the news industry who are very conscious of these ethical questions. However, there are others who are less scrupulous and will suggest that a freelance go there, and if the material is any good, we will take it. Which is obviously reduces their bill because you're not paying for any of the costs of the operation. You're only paying if the material is good, so that you've got no risk.
Economics has become part of the problem, as shrinking newsroom budgets and journalists losing jobs means media outlets are relying more on independent journalists. But on Syria, the industry has taken unusual steps to discourage freelancers from covering the war. Last year, a handful of British newspapers, including The Times, The Independent, The Guardian and The Observer, said they would no longer accept submissions from stringers. The work was just too dangerous. But the freelance community does get some support from organisations like the Frontline Freelancers Register and the Rory Peck Trust. Both are London-based and offer assistance, training, and in the case of Syria, advice. 9 months ago, the Trust released a statement asking freelance reporters to seriously consider turning down assignments in Syria.
Syria has become about as bad a situation as you can imagine for journalists, and I just can't see freelancers operating there safely when journalists are a commodity and kidnappings are as common as they're becoming. It's just not possible for them to operate with any by any measure of safety.
Most of the freelancers know what it means to work in a war zone, but they're also telling us that Syria is especially difficult because it's become so volatile and it's become so difficult to find who to trust. There are so many parties there. It's become so fragmented that it's really difficult to find a safe haven in between, inside that conflict.
Apparently we're meant to be under attack.
And there are people in the industry who say freelancers could also be doing more to protect themselves.
What I think has happened as a result of the Arab Spring has been a great number of young journalists going to the Middle East to sort of cut their teeth. The problem we found is that a lot of these guys are fairly inexperienced, haven't been to conflict zones necessarily before, and lack the skills, both journalistically and, frankly, survival skills, to look after themselves.
I've heard fair criticisms that some, especially younger freelancers, do go into conflict zones and dangerous situations for the wrong reasons. I don't think that many people are jumping into something that's as violent as Syria without really thinking about it. It's not a comfortable lifestyle. You're often living with bucket showers and a lack of electricity and surviving off tuna fish and bread for a week at a time. Those conditions are not conducive to keeping people around who really don't want to be there and be doing that work for the right reasons.
No one can really say what motivates journalists like American reporter Austin Tice, who went missing in 2012, or French photographer Remy Oshlik, who was killed in Syria that same year. Like so many freelancers, they have paid a price for trying to tell a story that too many journalists have become a part of.
More Global Village voices now on the perils of freelancing in Syria.
Freelancers are not victims of the media system. They deliberately choose to be at the front line and to live in conflict zones. This allows them to be a great resource for the newsrooms. Staff reporters are not precious. I think they are simply too expensive to afford even for big media companies. But it's important that freelancers are not treated like stopgaps, exploiting them only because they have the guts to be on the front line.
Reporting in Syria is currently more dangerous than it's ever been. I wouldn't say that it's unreportable. People are still getting in and getting their stories. I don't think that freelancers are put at greater risk on the job than staffers. When you're there, it's the same. But the problems come when things go wrong. Take, for example, the two Spanish journalists who were recently released from Raqqa. The staffer had his wages paid throughout the duration of his incarceration, whereas the freelancer had to rely on his parents, I believe, to pay his rent back home.
Finally, back to net neutrality, only this time a comedic take on what is a complicated subject. The Internet Must Go is the name of a mockumentary made by a producer in the United States, Gina Konstantinakos. It tells the story of a fictional marketing guy, a lobbyist hired by the big telecommunications companies to sell the public on the idea that net neutrality, all that stuff about fast lanes, slow lanes, and the last mile doesn't really matter. It's a cautionary tale on what could happen should big internet service providers get their way on a free and open internet. The fake documentary has reached around 250,000 viewers since its release last year. We've made it our web video of the week, and we'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Welcome to the future of the internet.
Their plans were big.
Cleaner, faster internet. We set it up like cable. Are you with me?
And I went across the country to talk to everyone about it.
Folks want to learn how to fix the internet, just like cable. You know what you're getting. You got it tiered.
Yeah, but you're only getting what the cable companies give you.
I tackled the opposition with everything I had.
It's a battle between the future of technology, the future of media.
Well, the future of the internet could be cable. So the future of the internet is the past.
Are you from one of these corporate interests?
Well, I'm not allowed to disclose that. We all know that online is filled with garbage and smut, and it should all just be completely shoved to the side and have the corporations start over.
Wait, what?
But after 6 months of market research,
The internet itself is a finite resource.
No, but go on.
There already are rules and laws.
Wait, you mean the rules that the lobbyists wrote?
You don't really know what you're talking about, do you?
Let's pretend for a second that I don't.
Thank you for coming in, because it reminds me why I try to warn people about the folks like you doing what you do.
I've decided
You aren't going to build any internet down here, and you also stop them from building their own. Okay.
to go a bit off script.
Hope this works.